Yes, we are joined by the one and only Mark Sleboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. Mark, man, you are the person to talk to today. I am super curious about your take on events. How you doing today?
Jamaro, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure on the show, and I'm pretty shocked, horrified, and depressed.
Yeah, same here. I have a sense of melancholy. In fact, I had a sense of melancholy about it all weekend because I have my former producer has family there. And some of the people that we brought onto the show have family there, and all of them are absolutely terrified. There's this weird chest thumping in the West for a guy who's literally on our terrorist watch list with a $10 million bounty on his head that is just taking power. So, yeah, I guess my first question to you is how on earth did the Syrian army collapse that fast? Over 2 weeks? It was almost like tissue paper just crumbling up from a band of rebels. What happened in this?
Okay, so, I mean, there's going to be a lot of retroactive analysis, a lot of blame storming between Russia and Iran and, Syrians who regret the fall of the Syrian government over exactly what has happened. So let's review what we know. So there was a freeze of the conflict in Syria. There has never been an end to the Syrian conflict. There has never been any formal peace deal. There was a freeze of the Syrian conflict, or at least two sides of the Syrian conflict, worked out under the auspices of what was called the Astana framework, after the capital of Kazakhstan, where the process began. And this was between Russia and Iran on one side, representing the Syrian government, and their ally Hezbollah, who was also involved in the conflict. And the other side of it was represented by Turkey, which represented Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Free Syrian Army, then rebranded as the Syrian National Army, and the other 31 flavors of jihad and Islamism. That one by one, the West and the Gulf states had dropped, right? They had dropped out of the conflict after Russia intervened. The U.S. dropped the Islamists and switched to the Kurds under the Trump administration, right? So first of all, that left out 1/3 of the conflict, right? Because it had devolved into a three-way Mexican standoff between the Syrian government, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, having the majority of the country and the population. The Turks and their jihadist and Islamist allies and proxies camped out all along all 30 kilometers deep inside northern Syria and in the northern part of Idlib province. And then the United States and their Kurdish proxies and former ISIS tribes, former Arab tribes in the east that had sworn fealty to ISIS and then abandoned it. They were camped out in Syria's east, sitting on Syria's oil and wheat fields. So that three-way Mexican standoff, two sides didn't resolve their differences, but agreed to freeze them. And this left the jihadists of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is simply rebranded Al-Qaeda, in control of northern Idlib, as kind of a mini caliphate, where they received I want to say largely indirect support of the Turks, right? The Turks would transfer weapons and supplies and money to their direct proxies in the Syrian National Army, and then the Syrian National Army would just hand it over to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as part of deals, and that was known. All right, there was no question that this was happening. There was no question that Al-Qaeda had Turkish support. But the conflict was frozen. However, there was I would say different, both sides interpreted the documents or the spirit of the documents differently. As far as Russia and Iran were concerned, the Turks were supposed to separate the jihadists, the terrorists, from the legitimate Syrian opposition, quote unquote, and then take care of the jihadists. That's what they were supposed to do, right? Of course, they did none of it. They armed their own proxies directly, and they armed and trained Al-Qaeda, right? There was never any action taken against them. There was a few aborted attempts at joint Russian-Turkish patrols along some highways in the Idlib region. It never worked out, never amounted to everyone. Everyone hated each other. But the conflict lulled into quiet there for nearly 5 years, right? Up until September. And September, we started having warnings or eager announcements from the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, which is a Syrian Islamist propaganda mouthpiece in the United Kingdom. Actually, it's one guy, basically one Syrian propagandist, right? That is quoted again and again and has been quoted in Western media since 2011, as if there's some type of objective authority rather than Islamist propaganda. They announced that the forces in Idlib, right, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, i.e. rebranded Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They've undergone this rebranding process several times. And there's a number of other jihadis, most of them actually foreign jihadis, that work under or that agreed to kind of a loose fealty to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and were allowed to cohabitate northern Idlib region. Maybe one of the foremost among them, the most infamous, there's lots of them, but one of the foremost among them is the Turkestan Islamic Party, right, which is composed large numbers of Salafist former Chinese Uyghurs and Central Asians, and they're one of the most notorious of the jihadist organizations. But that they were preparing to launch renewed offensives, ignoring or violating the Astana agreements that were supposedly, Turkey doesn't support them, but manages to speak for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, right? And that wink and a nod. Now, Russia and Iran at this time are both preoccupied. Russia is preoccupied, obviously, with a proxy war against all of NATO in Ukraine, and Iran has their eye on Gaza and Hezbollah, in the conflict with Israel. In mid-October, there were enough warning signs about the building up of jihadist forces at this point that relatively quietly, Russia began major airstrikes in Idlib that they had not been conducting for years, right? And we're talking, 50 airstrikes in a week, and then they started major drone attacks and helicopter attacks as well. This was mid-October. As far as we can tell, the Syrian army really did nothing to prepare for this, right? That they didn't build up troops, they didn't build defenses, they didn't conduct any significant offensive strikes or operations of their own. The Iranians say they were aware that this is happening. Now they're saying this, and that they warned, but there's no evidence that they did anything either up until it was or offered to do anything until it was essentially too late. In mid-November, Al Jazeera ran a piece saying again the same thing, that the rebels, Al Qaeda in Idlib, was about to launch a major offensive on the Aleppo area. And then it kicked off on November 27th. And very quickly, amazingly quickly, Aleppo was first approached, surrounded, and taken. And in quick succession, within days after that, the city of Hama fell. Now, what's important about these is in the first phase, or the first Syrian conflict, it's really the same conflict. It was just frozen. So in the before the freeze, all of Aleppo had never fallen to the jihadis, right? Half of it had, but the Syrian army hung on valiantly, right, to the other half, and eventually, with Russian and Iranian and Hezbollah help, managed to take all of Aleppo back and drive then the jihadis up into Idlib, where they signed this fool's deal with Erdogan to freeze the conflict. So Aleppo fell. Hama had never fallen in the first conflict, and it fell in a day, right? A day and a half, maybe. So what it appears has happened is there was very little actual fighting. Very little. Not none, but very little. Most of the Syrian Arab army forces, it appeared, withdrew or threw down their weapons and ran away, or actually defected to the opposition. And what it appears to me is that there was a very intense effort over the last 5 years to infiltrate, infiltrate, co-opt the Syrian military. And it has to be said that it really appears that this Syrian military is not the Syrian military of 5 years ago, that it has undergone a huge rot, a rotation of top officers, or a moving them out. There are reports in the Russian telegram sphere, which I cannot confirm, that most of the top officers who were trained by or worked closely with the Russians were removed, with people supposedly more loyal to the Assad family, right? Assad has been prickly about his sovereignty of Syria, and that's understandable. But this has gone on. It appears there was a major attempt to co-opt the Syrian military, right? So we're talking bribery, buying them out, blackmail, whatever works for the specific Syrian army officer, and also local administration, political officials, bureaucrats, clan leaders, because there still is very much a minority ethnic clan area. This happened not only in the Aleppo area, but much wider, right? There's some people who were suggesting that, they just had intentions around Aleppo and then they had so much success. No, they also infiltrated all of these cities, and all the cities, right? All the way down into Damascus and in Daraa in southern Syria, with sleeper cells that also activated and created the sense of chaos, and that they were everywhere and that they were overrunning everything. So as far as I can tell, large portions, perhaps the majority of the Syrian army, their officers, their commanders, their political, whoever, ordered them to just retreat or stand down. And there are videos going around on the net now of Russian military walking through areas that had previously been controlled by the Syrian army. And there are just enormous piles of camouflage military uniforms, weapons, everything that were thrown down. They stripped out of their uniforms and their rankings, and they put on civilian clothes. And to do this in such large numbers, right? This isn't a spontaneous thing of people in trenches, right? This is in their own bases and everything. They were ordered to do this by their commanding officers. So now there are Syrian forces that fought outnumbered and bravely, like the Tiger forces, right?
Yeah.
The Syrian special military forces, but it wasn't enough. And Russian air support, while intense in the beginning, you can only do so much if the Syrian army is not there to fight on the ground, right? Russia's contingent in Syria was down to some 400 people, right? That's it. And the Russian Air Force was working 24/7, right? While before this and while it was going on, once it kicked off. The other thing is that while there are large numbers of these, jihadis, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the new Syrian, or the Syrian National Army directly administered by the Turks, also then moved in, and the rebels in the south and the Daraa area rose up again. Well, large numbers of them are still, crazy jihadis riding around in pickup trucks with machine guns, right? But there was a vanguard force that obviously had, I'm not sure whether it was Turkish military training or Western military training, but they had night vision goggles. They had drones and electronic warfare jamming that they knew how to use, that possibly could have come from the Kiev regime. We know they were bragging that they had been providing this. I'm not sure whether they had advanced training. They knew what they were doing. They had superior equipment. They had howitzers, self-propelled howitzers. They had tanks, right? This is a trained Al-Qaeda with tanks and howitzers and air defense and electronic warfare and drones. And where the Syrian army did fight, like the Tiger forces, they had obviously not been updated with the military practices, particularly with drone use, that has evolved over the last 5 years, that any country that is not keeping on top of is falling behind. Now, I think that the drone use of the jihadis can be overstated, right? But they were definitely doing it. But I think the majority of the element, why it fell so fast, is co-option. And there's actually a long history of this if you look at conflicts that the U.S. has been involved in. Whether this was all Turkish intelligence, I don't know. I doubt that. I think that the CIA and MI6 and Mossad were all probably thoroughly involved in this effort, because it must have been massive. In Iraq in 2003, there was actually very little fighting, right? Most of the Iraqi army was co-opted and bought out. Their families moved out of the country, promises made of money and whatever, the regime is going to fall, save yourself and your family, or we've got pictures of that woman you're sleeping with. Do you want your wife to see them? Whatever it takes, on an individual basis. But that was done on a massive scale in Iraq. And that resulted that Iraq, what had been a very large army at the time,
right,
very little of it actually fought. It also happened in Libya at the end, not in the very beginning, but at the end in Tripoli, where the commander of the defense of Tripoli just opened the gates and ordered his forces to stand down, which, of course, ultimately led to the raping death of Gaddafi. So there's a history. This works. This works very well when there is cracks, when there is fissures, when there is doubt in the government. And it didn't work. This was attempted back when this conflict first kicked off in 2011, but it didn't work. But what has happened in particular over the last 5 years is the Syrian economy has been absolutely hollowed out, I mean, to an extent that it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around. The sanctions, the Western sanctions, crippled them, cut them off from economic finance, and the U.S. camped out on Syria's oil fields and wheat fields, preventing those resources from either making the country money or even supplying. Syria, an oil producer, the government had to import oil, right? And a Syrian army officer was making about $30 a month. There was power in Aleppo 4 hours a day.
Wow.
There was problems with water. There was rationing of food, right? There was no hope for a better life. And under those conditions, when you've got being contacted by foreign agents and intelligence offering, hey, it's all going to end. You and your family can be saved from this. You can have a guaranteed income. All you have to do is not fight and die for a regime that and it has to be said that there was corruption in Damascus, like most countries, right? But there was an Alawite elite around Assad that lived in an extravagant lifestyle.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. And that never ended. In fact, it probably got worse in the last 5 years. And the majority of the Syrian population are Sunnis, 60-some%, right? Now, then there's the Alawites and the Shia and the Druze and the Kurds and all the other minorities. And the Christians, of course, can't forget them. And Assad was seen as the protector of them. But what kind of protector, can't keep the lights on, people can't get gas to fill their gas tanks, and their children have to be rationed and so forth. So this economic hollowing out set the conditions for this. It was very intentional. The U.S. officials were very clear that what they were doing, that they helped to force regime change by sanctions, and they needed that extra push of this covert operation, and then the jihadi horde descending. And there was also military conditions. When Israel invaded southern Lebanon, Hezbollah moved all their forces out of the country, a lot of them around the Aleppo area, to go back to fight for home in Lebanon. So Hezbollah was off the field. The Russian contingent was very small, and they were doing what they could beforehand with the resources they had, but they began, I think, to probably get more and more dismayed as there was no signs that the Syrian army was really doing anything in a major way. And at the end, the Iranians offered to send troops and the popular mobilization units, but they never actually arrived in the country because it all happened so fast. And in the last day or so, they literally stopped at the border. And it has to be said that the U.S. had begun strafing the Iraqi popular mobilization units, the Shia, as they were coming into eastern Syria with A-10 Warthogs, gunships, and drones, effectively operating as the Air Force for Al-Qaeda. Yeah, wow. They said they were doing it out of self-defense.
Well, they even came out and said, well, this has nothing to do with the battlefield. And it's like, okay, get out of here with that nonsense. I'm curious on the Doha talks. And Lavrov had a conversation with Al Jazeera, apparently after those talks. He was not necessarily in the best of spirits. What came out of those conversations? I would imagine that had to be a maddening.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it was something along the line like, "What are you doing? We're winning." Yeah, you thought we lost, right? There was a moment back when the Astana agreements were finalized and the conflict was frozen, where Erdogan had to go to Moscow, right, to speak to Putin. He was essentially, he had to go, and he was kept waiting outside of the meeting room, in a waiting room in the Kremlin that was carefully decorated with historical pieces of art showing the defeats of the Ottoman Empire by the Romanov Russian Empire. I'm going to tell you that there are analysts out there who are saying that what Assad needed to do was appease Erdogan more. He needed to meet with him. No. Erdogan is a treacherous and cunning beast. And I'm going to tell you that right then, right when he was forced into this humiliating freezing of the conflict, where his jihadi proxies were on the back step and so forth, he set it on revenge then, right? What Assad wanted was officiation of his control of northern Syria. He wanted that official. Maybe it would still on paper be part of Syria, but he wanted it given broad autonomy as a Sunni Islamist region that he could that would ultimately owe his fealty to him. That he had already purged most of the Kurds out of that area, and there was a political problem he had, right? Other than he had to keep 100,000 jihadis essentially on the paycheck, right? Because that's how big, he was there, how many there were between the Syrian National Army and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But there was several million refugees, Syrian refugees, many of them families and Sunni Islamists who had fled the civil war and who didn't, they were Sunni Islamists, right? By and large, they didn't want to live under the Syrian government. They wanted to live in a Sunni Islamist state, so they were a continual drain on the Turkish economy. And the one thing that all the political factions in Turkey agreed on was they hated these refugees. They wanted them gone. They were sucking up money. They were driving down wages, taking low wages jobs. They were involved in crime networks and so forth. It was a continual political thorn in Erdogan's, re-election ability. So he wanted to transport all of them back to northern Syria and settle them there and essentially become an autonomous region of Syria that he controlled, right? Populated almost exclusively by Sunni Islamists. And Assad would, and I say Assad, but I'm sure very much that, Assad is not a fiat dictator. He has to manage Syria's political elites. And the Syrian political elites would have nothing. They regarded Erdogan as a betrayer, as a backstabber, as someone who was literally, arming and equipping, head chopping, suicide bombing jihadis to kill them and their families, right? They couldn't agree to this. They couldn't agree to give up effective sovereignty to Erdogan over this part of Syria. They thought they could wait him out, and that they had Russia and Iran's support, and that would protect them. Well, it wasn't enough in the end. Erdogan was cunning. He arranged this. I'm sure the U.S. was whispering in his ear and encouraging him on this, and providing some intelligence and other assistance. But that itself, we're going to see, because if you think it's all over, I very much doubt that. First of all of these jihadi groups have been at each other's throats all the time in Idlib and between those in Idlib and the Syrian National Army Turkish occupied area. Also, you have to remember there's the third player in all of this. There's the Kurdish proxies with the U.S. occupation in East Syria.
Right.
Now, obviously, Erdogan hates the Kurds more than anything else, right? He considers them all terrorists, right? And even a U.S. general admitted that the SDF is simply the YPG rebranded for all intents and purposes. So these jihadis now have already started to move east to Manbij, right? And supposedly in the last 24, there are Turkish reports, that they have control of Manbij already. And I very much doubt they're stopping there. The jihadi telegram channels are already talking about the upcoming siege to go all the way to Raqqa, right, which is occupied by the U.S.-backed Kurds now.
Yeah.
So right now the U.S. is trying to stop, or trying to talk to Erdogan and getting him to put his jihadis back on the leash. But why should he, right? As far as he's concerned, the U.S. for the last 6-7 years has been supporting terrorists against him. Right. The fact that he's supporting Al-Qaeda against Syria, notwithstanding, everyone's definitions of terrorists are different. My definition of terrorists, the Syrian government's definition of terrorists, Al-Qaeda. He sees as Erdogan. He's pragmatic. He's an opportunist, but he is also a political Islamist. That's his family, his background, his political party. He sees Al-Qaeda as brothers, right? As political, religious brothers. Meanwhile, he sees the Kurds as the terrorists. So in all of these nonsense Astana agreements, right, they're talking about terrorists, and they're talking about completely different people, right? And that was the fiction of the Astana agreements. And there's lots of blame to go around. There's corruption, there's weakness of Assad, but I place a great deal of responsibility on the Kremlin, on the Iranian government, forever agreeing to this freeze of the conflict, to let a jihadi army sit out in northern Idlib and regather their strength, and to ever trust Erdogan, right? I agree with not going to direct war with Turkey, right? To manage, that the economic costs, the geopolitical costs would be one high. But you deal with him like a snake, and you keep the boot on the snake. Erdogan respects strength, but nothing else. That's the way that I think that you have to deal with him. Now, all of this has huge geopolitical repercussions.
Wait, Russia, the geopolitical implications, the Doha agreements, it was that
nothing
in those agreements that. Well, I was going to ask you the military bases, because Russia got assurances that nothing would take place with the military bases. Were those, by it?
I mean, maybe that was agreed to at the time when, effectively Lavrov and the Iranian foreign minister come begging to the Turkish foreign minister, right? Because he had all the cards, all the leverage at that point. But do you think for 1 second that's going to last? Mm-hmm. I don't. I don't even think in the medium term that Russia wants to have military bases in a country that, they said it's too early to talk about it, to make decisions. But Russia doesn't do Salafist jihadis. They don't like them, right? They've got enough problems with them and don't. And among their ranks are hundreds, if not thousands, of jihadists, of Salafists from southern Russia, from Chechnya, from Ingushetia in Dagestan, from Central Asia, particularly in the Turkestan Islamic Party, but in others, right? And now they could have a whole country to play and train in and re-export their jihad back to southern Russia and Central Asia. This is why Russia got involved in Syria in the first place. And now, look at this. Russia has lost. For years now, people were talking that Russia's back in the Middle East in a big way, and all the Gulf states respecting strength and loyalty, started to have good relations with Russia and curry favor with Putin and everything. That's all gone now, right? People don't have respect for a loser, someone who lost in such a dramatic way. And Russia's losing their military bases. They're losing, what was considered, wasn't really, but a Russian proxy state. And it was taken away just like that in this embarrassing shock. Iran as well. It's hard to see how the axis of resistance isn't crippled.
And Iran is let's get into the geopolitical implications. What does this mean for Russia? What does this mean for Iran? Wesley Clark had pointed out that they were going to go through all of these states. Syria, Iran was next after Syria. So give me your take. What does this mean geopolitically for Russia now that they've lost this kind of state in the Middle East. What does it mean for Iran?
Yeah, it means Russia has lost their influence in the Middle East, and they're very unlikely to get involved again in the Middle East or anywhere outside their immediate near abroad again in the foreseeable future. Because there's lots of people saying, what did we waste all of this money and lives and everything for during those years where we, saved the Syrian state and then it collapsed overnight on us, and they didn't, as far as anyone can tell, really even fight to save it. So, I mean, that's a huge blow. I mean, Russia's obviously going to double down and focus on Ukraine. But even in Ukraine, now all the Western leaders are going to be saying to themselves, look how weak Russia is. It's all a Potemkin village, right?
Trump has
all of that Russia
Yeah.
has in Ukraine can be gone just as quickly. All we have to do is stay the course, right? That is what they'll be saying to themselves.
Trump has already said it. Trump has said Russia's lost 600,000 people in Ukraine. Look how weak they were. They couldn't defend the Syrian government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's Kiev regime propaganda. Iran, the axis of resistance, which is Iran's influence throughout the Middle East, is going to be crippled now. How do you re-equip and arm Hezbollah with Syria now controlled by Salafists, right? How does that? It becomes, it's not impossible, right? But it will be done on a much smaller scale. Hezbollah will not be a force that Israel has to fear anymore. In fact, Lebanon could be under siege as well next, right? This could activate Sunni forces in Lebanon to act against Hezbollah, right, with Israeli support. The big winners here are Turkey, first and foremost, right? The Neo-Ottoman Empire is in full bloom, right? He's won in Azerbaijan and Armenia. He's at least come to a draw against Russia in Libya, and now this huge victory. I mean, the Arab states are going to be very cautious. They don't want Turkey to have this much power in the Middle East. That's why I think they in part switched back to Russia as balancing out too much Turkish influence in the Middle East. But that's gone now. So he's back in the Middle East as an Ottoman sultan in a major way. Israel benefits hugely from this. Hezbollah is now crippled, and Gaza is completely at their mercy. For anyone who thinks that Al-Qaeda is going to suddenly come to the rescue of the Palestinians now, you are a fool. When has Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of these Salafist groups ever done anything against Israel? Never, right? In fact, there were statements out of Jolani's circle, right? The leader of Al-Qaeda, who, by the way, was formerly the deputy leader of ISIS. He is now the leader of Al-Qaeda, rebranded. He's on an FBI wanted list, and he's recognized by both the U.S. And the UN as a terrorist, right? As a wanted terrorist leading a terrorist organization. But now he suddenly woke Al-Qaeda, right? The diversity-friendly jihadi. Yeah, that's him. $10 million reward from the State Department. So now that the U.S. is going to do what they have previously done with the Mujahideen Calc, with the Kosovo Liberation Army, with Azov, right? They're going to delist, detoxify people they have previously recognized as terrorists and extremists, because now it's geopolitically convenient for them to do so.
What are you expecting from this? I mean, when in Libya, Iraq, when this happened, those governments utterly collapsed. And, I guess my expectation is the same in this situation. But what is yours going forward?
So first of all, the big thing will be, can the U.S. manage? Can the U.S. get Erdogan to put the leash back on the jihadis, or will the new civil war in Syria be against the Salafists against the Kurds fighting alone, right? And I no longer have any sympathy for the Kurds after years of being U.S. proxies. I might have at one point, but not anymore. And if they kill each other, I have lack of concern at this point, right? We're out of the game. You know, Russia lost, right? Russia's out of this for all intents and purposes. They'll see what happens, right? They're pragmatic. They'll take their losses on the chin and you know, bear it. But you know, trusting Erdogan ever was, I'm sorry, a huge mistake, and it has cost. And after that, there'll be the question of internal civil war between the various jihadist and Islamist factions that it's very questionable whether Turkey and the US, the West, will be able to manage their differences through their respective groups in Syria. So Syria could be looking at decades of civil war, and we have to be careful that this doesn't extend into Lebanon and Iraq, because it's very possible that it could. This could reactivate Sunni extremist forces in Iraq. It could launch attacks against Hezbollah and the Christian population in Lebanon. Israel has already occupied the entirety of the Golan Heights now, and Mount Hebron in southern. Do you think, you know, anyone's going to move against them? No, of course not. So now one of them, the major player, has been taken off the board, and now it's about Turkey and the Salafists, which are for years now firmly under left under Turkish control, and the U.S. has their proxy Kurdish and SDF forces. And can they manage their differences? How involved was the U.S. in what actually happened? Was it only incidental, or were they the driving force and everything has already been settled? We don't know. But both Russia and Iran are the big losers. I mean, other obviously than Syria and the Syrian people. This discussion in the Western media. Oh, the Syrian people are not. Which Syrian people are you talking about? Not the Christians, not the Alawites, not the Syria, not the Druze, not, you know. Okay, so the Sunni Islamists are happy. And again, not all Sunni in Syria are Islamists. That's again still a minority. That's not. I'm not anti-Sunni. I'm anti-Sunni Islamist and Salafist, right?
Why would? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, they're the biggest victims, right? Other Muslims, whether Sunni or Shia, are the biggest victims of the Islamists and the jihadists, because they are the ones targeted, you know, as apostates, right? To their puritanical, twisted reading of Islam.
Why would Erdogan stop? I mean, the Kurds are considered terrorists by Erdogan. Why would he stop his jihadists from taking all of Syria at that point? I mean, wouldn't they give him more control over the entirety of Syria in general? Okay,
so I mean, there would of course be a cost involved, right? He has to keep these forces supplied and so forth. And I think at some point, if he stays sober, he will understand the possibility of overreach. But now it will be a game of what can you offer me? What can you offer me, right? Because that's, you know, what it's always about with Erdogan, right? You know, he is he's cunning in that way. I despise the man, but to geopolitically underestimate his type of cunning and looking out for himself and playing the U.S. off of Russia and the Islamic world off the West and so forth. I mean, he's done it very skillfully for, you know, a couple of decades now, and he will continue to do it up until he fails. And then I imagine his end will be rather quick and dramatic. But he has the leverage now, and everyone's going to be coming and paying court to Erdogan, right? If you want to save some of the Kurds, you go to him, right? Whoever wants in Syria now, he is holding more cards than anyone else for sure. And can he keep Giuliani? woke Al Qaeda now as he's being. He's like, oh, that was a phase of my life when I was deputy leader of the brutality of ISIS, and yes, I was the leader of Al Qaeda in Syria, but I've moved on. That was a phase of my life. Like I was a goth teenage girl once, and I got over that phase of my life. That's the way the Western media and all of the 50,000 or so jihadis under him, they also had Damascene conversions, and now they're woke. I saw the CNN interview of him, and they had his name, and then they had his pronouns. He, him. It's that bordering between obscene and absurd that is.
But they're trying to sanitize the terrorists. I mean, the idea that, I went through a phase of chopping off heads, but I've changed now. It's like, okay, sure you have. The
Western mainstream media is the most vile, obscene bunch of whitewashers and apologists, and it's just coming to a crux now. Before, there was the pretense of a Syrian National Council or everything. Now it's just whitewashing the leader of Al Qaeda in Syria, a former ISIS leader himself, right? It's because there's no challenge to it. There's no criticality. There's no anything.
What does this mean for Iran? By the way, I mean, Israel is creating its greater Israel. Hezbollah has been decapitated. Netanyahu has already come out claiming credit for all of this. Like I said,
Trump has already said that he is going to destroy Iran with sanctions, right? That he's going to revert to an economic war. But now lots of people are going to be whispering in his ear, look how easy Assad's government fell. We could do the same thing to Iran. Because there's no question that Assad has thoroughly infiltrated Iran, right? They're able to assassinate people and do sabotage and terror attacks with complete impunity in Iran on a major basis. They are not quite, but almost as vulnerable to co-option and subversion, right? As Syria was. Everyone's going to be saying now Iran is next, and they're going to be saying, look, we rewrote the region already. We can go one step further and put a new Shah back in, or whatever it takes. Those will be lots of those neocons. They're very much anti-Iranian and pro-Israeli, and they're going to be whispering that in Trump's ears, so they could encourage him to go from economic warfare to covert warfare, to direct warfare, whatever it takes to get rid of Iran. Iran is in the targets now.
I mean, Iran was in the target going back to 2007 under the Bush administration. I mean,
but now they've lost their strategic depth and influence in the region, right? Now their biggest ally is gone. They're now at a further logistical and support remove from the entire axis of resistance. And the axis of resistance was already starting to have its doubts about Iran because Pezeshkian has been so weak, so timid in responses. So I'm would be very shocked now. I'm not saying the axis of resistance is gone, but it's going to be crippled. And it's probably going to start to fade away. And this is also shocking because just a few months ago, the axis of resistance seemed so strong, right? Just a half a year ago. And now,
Mark, 2 more questions before I let you go.
Like building a foundation in sand.
Yeah, just faded away. Russia is coming up with a security partnership with Iran. What does it mean?
We don't even. Is that going to happen now?
That was kind of what I'm getting at. What does it mean now in this context?
Yeah, I don't know what it means. I don't, because I don't know what's in it. I very much is supposedly a deepened, strengthened relationship. I'm sure intelligence sharing, C4 ISR, military technical joint building of some systems, that sort of thing. But I mean, I very much doubted that it included a mutual defense clause like with North Korea. But I mean, I also would have said the same thing about the mutual defense clause with North Korea, that it wasn't going to happen. But now everything has got to be called into question, right? Both Russia and Iran, they're going to a certain extent probably going to be blaming each other, right? There's going to be soul searching, recrimination, examination. I would not be surprised at all if this strategic partnership signing gets delayed and possibly even disappears. Yeah. Now, there's already a strategic partnership between Russia and Iran, right? This was supposed to be a deeper, more comprehensive one.
What could they have done differently? Be the Assad, Putin, meaning, was this a fait accompli? Was there anything differently that they could have done in order to prevent, stave this off, or stop it in its entirety?
So, I mean, that's armchair quarterbacking, of course, but myself, I think the Astana agreements were as flawed as the Minsk agreements were, right? It was Putin's tendency to always reach for diplomatic solutions. And in an ideal world, that is admirable, right? But you almost wouldn't expect it from the caricatured vision of a Russian leader. But Putin is very legalistic. He's very cautious. But I think both were a mistake. I think that you have to deal with the Kiev regime and with Erdogan from a position of strength, and you don't take your eye off the ball. You don't take your boot off the snake, right? They never should have let Idlib breed another generation. Remember, so it's been 5 years, right, of Al-Qaeda control of Idlib. Children that were 14 and 15
19
are now fighters, right? They were raised, right? And the same thing is happening in Ukraine. When Azov goes into schools and gives their Banderite fascist ideological indoctrination to Ukrainian children, turning them into, the next generation of anti-Russian warriors, right? That it's should be a huge recognition of Russia, of how dangerous that was and this was, right? But of course, Russia does have limits to what they can do with their hard power. Now, though, their army is much bigger, much stronger, much more experienced than it ever was before. I simply hope that they learn the right lessons from what has happened in Syria, and they don't attempt some ceasefire or freezing of the conflict or similar deal with Trump in Ukraine that will simply see the Kiev regime regrown only to have the conflict launched again. You don't stop. You dictate terms from strength on the battlefield, because unfortunately, that is the brutal, realist world we live in, and you don't give your enemies mercy. You don't give them anything, deal with them, yes, when you have them thoroughly defeated and they don't have the opportunity to rise again. That is the time for mercy, not before that.
Mark Sleboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. Mark, deeply appreciate your explanation, man. Like I said, this was utterly shocking to me that they collapsed.
Me too. I took my eye off the ball in Syria, and I had no idea that the Syrian army and the Syrian government had rotted and deteriorated that much and been co-opted ultimately, right? I'm as guilty of not keeping my eye on that ball as anyone else. Although I will say that I was against the Astana agreements when they were signed back in 2000, just as I was against the Minsk Accords when they were signed back then. That I will say that I was.
You're proven right on both. I mean, these agreements were used as just cudgels, time to build up militaries. They weren't, taken as earnest terms the way that I think Russia went into the belief that they were going to be. So, But Mark Sleboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. You can find him on YouTube on his channel, Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. Check that channel out. If you like his analysis here, you're going to love his channel. You can also find him on Facebook.com/Gramsci. Thank you for this, Mark. I really do appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me.
All right.